Welcome everyone, it's Kevin with VintiqueSound.com, and today we're having a look at the brand new Cubase Pro 11. So number one is the brand new plugin called Squasher. And this is a dynamics plugin that combines both upward and downward compression for up to 3 different bands, but it also has a drive knob and a gate for each band as well. So it's fairly complex, but let's actually listen to what this does. Number 2 is the updated Frequency 2 plugin with dynamic EQ mode. So you now have access to dynamic EQing for each individual band. And you can turn it on and off with a simple click of a button. And if you click on the little drop-down menu here, you can actually adjust the settings. What's cool is with this view is you can flip between very quickly the dynamic setting and the actual EQ setting, but then you can also flip the view from the multi-band view to the single band view. So this is a much needed update. I'm sure many of you are aware of the vast number of dynamic EQ plugins at your disposal, and I'm sure many of you understand the benefit of using dynamic EQ plugins as opposed to just EQing or just using a multi-band compressor. Number 3 is a brand new imager plugin, which can help you to expand or reduce the stereo width for up to 4 bands. So up here you can see the crossover frequency for each band. There's a volume output for each band. And down here you can see the actual width knob. But then you also have an individual scope and phase correlation display for each band. And up here you can see where you can reduce the number of bands or increase them. So I've chosen this preset here, expanded wideness, and I'm going to just reduce this slightly to 135-ish. And this plugin is actually on the mix bus. So we're going to play this and we're going to hear what it does to the mix.
This is one black hole, this is one black hole.
Number 4 is the SuperVision metering plugin. Now this thing is quite the beast. I've actually chosen a preset right here, the last one in the drop-down. And this thing has a whole bunch of different modules. Some for just straight up signal, some for spectral frequency analysis, some for phasing, some for spatial, and then also waveform analysis.
This is one black hole, this is one black hole. That happens at the black hole.
when I double click on each one of these modules, it brings that in full screen within the plugin. Now let's check out another one here with Multipan, I think it's called. This is very interesting. I've never seen this one before.
This is one black hole. 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 This is a cookie. This is a cookie. This is a cookie. This happens at the black hole. 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 It's entangled with the cookie. It's entangled with the cookie. It's entangled with the cookie. It's entangled.
So yeah, there's so many different modules. It's actually mind-blowing how much there is in here. Full suite of loudness metering with true peak monitoring. You have a chromogram is what they call it. There's an oscilloscope and then a full spectrogram. And you can see here there's the standard correlation meter, but then this one is a multi-correlation meter. This one is a panorama scope. This one's a phase scope. Down here you have a wave circle. You have the time indicator. There's so much, and you can see here, this is where you actually select for each individual module. You can replace it with whatever you want and customize it. So yeah, this is excellent. I'm going to be using this a lot actually. Number 5 is an updated sampler track. So here I'm going to import this drum loop. So one very welcome addition is the ability to use slicing within the sampler track. So I think most of us are very familiar with the hit point detection, and the slicing abilities is basically taken from what we already know of what's possible elsewhere in Cubase. So for instance, you can automatically detect transients. You can slice at a particular grid mark. So here I would probably want to set a grid of, let's say, 16ths or maybe 1/8. And you can do a combination of transient detection and grid. And you can also do manual slicing. I'm going to start with the transient mode. And by setting the threshold, I can set at what level do I want Cubase to recognize the different hit points. And now if you have a look on the bottom here, it's actually mapping each added hit point to a new key, starting from the C3 key. So as I reduce the threshold, it reduces the number of hit points. And when I let go, you can see it's actually reducing the number of assigned keys. So now when I activate this channel and I play on my keyboard, I can actually play all the individual slices by going one after the other on the keyboard. And now everything is cleaned up the way that I want, and I can actually drag in the MIDI phrase into the sampler track right here. You can hear there's a little bit of a stutter in between the different chops. There are now 2 global LFOs that you can use to modulate the pitch, the filter, and the amp envelope. So when you click the little mod button on either the pitch, the filter, or the amp, you can see on the right-hand side here, this is the global LFO section, where basically you can choose the LFO shape. I have a set frequency for LFO number 1, and then a faster frequency at a sine wave for LFO number 2. The shape of the LFO signal can be adjusted here. And then you can also scale the LFO output based off of the modulation wheel. So if we play this loop of that drum set, I'll start with the modulation activated and turn up and down. And I have the pitch modulated by LFO 1. So I have it quite exaggerated. Now again, you can modulate the filter and you can also modulate the amp. So just as an added demonstration of modulation, I have the LFO1 modulating the volume and it's tempo synced at quarter notes. And then I also have the panning modulated by the LFO number 2, which has a lower frequency. It's not tempo synced. I'm just going to show you one last thing, which is the quality of the playback. So you can have a standard playback, a high, best, or an extreme quality setting. You can also choose the vintage quality, which allows you to choose between different turntable settings, 33 and a third, 45 or 78. And then you also have the bit depth, so you can do down as far as 12, 10, or 8-bit sampling. And then you also have a sample rate. So you can even go down, I think it's as low as 8,000 hertz, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So you can get some really crunchy tones out of this. Number 6 is SpectraLayers One, which is a compact version of their full-featured spectral layers. I think they're on version 7 now. So this tool allows you to separate vocals from basically any other source, such as instruments or background noise. And this is actually very good for improving the dialogue from field recordings. So let's say you had a recording outside where there's lots of traffic noise and wind and whatnot. Or in this case, I have a snippet of an old recording with a voice with rain in the background.
Friends, Romans, countrymen.
So to get this audio into SpectraLayers, you want to highlight the event and control right click on a PC, and in the extensions tab you'll see SpectraLayers. You click this and it imports it into the SpectraLayer One. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the layer button and unmix vocals. And I'm going to set a sensitivity to -1. I've kind of been messing around with this, and that seems to have the most drastic reduction of background noise. And now it breaks this audio source down into 2 separate stems. One is the background noise, the other one is the vocal by itself.
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him.
So as you can hear, it makes a drastic difference, and it does a very good job. You can hear some aliasing and artifacts in there, but it does a really good job. So one more related improvement is the revised ARA 2.0 support. So I was able to edit this audio event using the ARA extension, as I showed here, and you no longer have to bounce that audio. And you can see here at the top right hand side of this audio event, it's indicating the extension is active, so to speak. And I can now just leave this the way that it is and continue working in my project. And it's going to keep all the edits and changes I've made in SpectraLayers One. Number 7 is a job queue management built into the export audio mixdown window, which you can find down below here. So let's say I was done my song and I wanted to export all of the stems, so the drums, the vocals, the bass, synths, all separately. And then I also wanted to export my final mix. So I would first select my mix bus, which is my entire mix, add that to the job queue, and then deselect it and select all my group channels, which amounts to all the different stems of my song, and add that to the queue, and then start the queue. So then all these jobs are exporting, and I can go and, let's say, go grab a bite to eat and come back and I have all these things exported for me. So that's great. There's a couple more features as well. One of them is that you can now, in the project window, actually highlight and select the channels that you want to export and actually sync that selection right here. So that just kind of makes things a little bit more visually intuitive. And then also there's a file format preset, which is nice. So if you're like me and you're constantly changing between different file formats, let's say for clients, you want to make sure that they have a WAV 24-bit 44.1 file export, and then also provide them with an MP3. You can then have just two separate, an MP3 and a WAV format preset. And what's even more amazing is when you combine these two new features. So what I've already done is selected to export a WAV file of my entire mix. And then I can also choose to export an MP3 version of my entire mix and add that to the queue. So now I have an entire song export in WAV, its MP3 equivalent, and then all of the stems in WAV. So this is going to be a huge time saver. Number 8 is several improvements and new features to the key editor. So one major thing is having the ability to view the global tracks at the top of the editor screen here. And the global tracks are any tracks that are on the top divider piece of the main project window. So this button right here, this divide track list, if I click this, it's going to not have a divided track list. So you can see now all my marker, chord track, arranger track, etc. These are now part of the main window. And when I scroll up and down, they move, up and down just like all the other tracks. But what I like to do is to divide these tracks separately from all the other tracks like audio, MIDI, group tracks, effects tracks, etc. Because when I'm editing and doing stuff in my project, I like to scroll up and down and always be able to see the markers, always be able to see the chord track, and to be able to see the ruler track with the seconds and the bars and beats. But now with the key editor, you actually have access to viewing these things at all times by enabling the global tracks. Another added feature is the scale assistant. So in this case, I do have a chord track, and you can use the chord track or you can just use an editor scale of your choosing, and you can choose any one of these options. Let's say I wanted to snap the pitch editing and I wanted to snap these to the chords and scales. When I click this button, you can see that it shifted those notes because they were out of sync with the chord track. And it's now adjusted them to the next closest note that falls within the actual chords and scales of the chord track. Another improvement is the redesigned pitch bend controller lane, which allows you to snap the pitch bend events to a respective seminote. So when you activate this, you can see here when I draw in, it's actually snapping the pitch bend to one of the closest semitones. But what's more is all of the lanes now have smooth automation, like we're familiar with the other automation lanes introduced in a previous version of Cubase. So this is an excellent addition because now not only are you able to pitch bend basically at perfect semitone pitch, but then also pitch bend incredibly smoothly with these smooth curved lines. Number 9 is support for variable DPI on Windows 10. So I don't use high DPI and I only have 1080p monitors. But with high DPI activated, some plugins wouldn't actually scale to the actual Windows setting that you had, whether it was 125%, 150%, and 250% scaling. So that means that the plugins that don't support this, maybe a plugin like this, which is fairly large sized, but at high DPI settings, it would be a very, very small plugin. So now it supports the ability to scale. It'll match the actual scaling settings that you have in Windows 10. So that might actually be more like a bug fix to some people. I know I've seen several comments of people complaining about this issue with Cubase in Windows 10. So I'm hoping that this will solve their issues. Number 10 is several new features to the score editor. So I'm very unfamiliar with the score editor, so I'm just going to read off verbatim on the list here. The new Properties tab lets you instantly access the options and settings for specific elements that you select in your notation. And with the note editing overlay, you can edit notes as conveniently as in the key editor. There are more workflow improvements, and the score editor now also supports the SMUFL font format, which brings Dorico's beautiful Bravura and Petaluma fonts to Cubase. So the remaining new features and improvements are pretty minimal, so I'm just going to kind of ramble them off one by one. The first one of those is, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that the marker tracks now actually have lines for each marker. And to activate this, you need to go into the Preferences window, and under Event Display and Markers, and you can choose whether to have the active markers only or all the marker tracks, or to remove them altogether. There's a small editing tweak. So now when you have the combined selection tool enabled and you select a particular range and then you split that selection range, for instance, using the keyboard shortcut Shift X, it now automatically selects that newly split event. The multi-tap delay plugin now supports up to 5.1 surround sound. The Maximizer channel strip module now offers a detailed view in the channel settings. So if you click this little E button, it's an expanded view, which also gives access to the classic and modern settings. There is now support for multiple sidechain inputs. So for plugins like the Squasher plugin, which has 3 separate bands, it has the ability to have 3 separate sidechain inputs. For instance, in the first band, I can have sidechain input 1, and when I click on the menu, this is sidechain input 1. I can then choose a source. Let's say it was the vocals, and then if I go to the next band, I can choose sidechain input 2, go to sidechain input 2, and then select a different sidechain input source altogether. And finally, there's roughly 5 more new features or improvements that I'm actually having difficulty finding a way to demonstrate to you. I only have a written source here, and I'm having difficulty being able to actually understand what they're talking about, but I'll read them out to you nevertheless. The direct offline processing window now allows you to pin processes, which eases the usage of plugins with a learning function. The version name of a track version can be shown or hidden in the track list. Selecting and editing polypressure events on the controller lane is much more intuitive now. You can define which pitches are visible in the event display and the piano keyboard display of the key editor. And the new context variables in the logical editor allow you to search for the highest or lowest note in a progression of chords, highest in chord from at least n notes, and lowest in chord from at least n notes, and to operate on those notes. So I'm not familiar with exactly what they mean, but so here you can see the context variable, which again, I'm not entirely sure what they mean here. I don't use the logical editor very much, so I don't have anything to demonstrate. Steinberg also redesigned many of the windows to match the new design of Cubase. So for instance, the audio connections window, the studio setup window, which is quite different now, My initial reaction to the list of additions, new features, and improvements was kind of a letdown in a sense. But now that I actually had a chance to play around with the new plugins, like the squasher, the new features in frequency, and the SuperVision plugin, and the imager plugin, and the addition of SpectraLayers One, as well as the sampler track improvements, and the added features to the export window, and the pitch bend and automation lanes for the key editor. All of these things are actually quite significant. So all in all, I'd say it's a pretty decent upgrade. If you haven't upgraded to Cubase 10.5 yet, then it might actually be, fully worth the upgrade, because then you would get several other new features like the multi-tap delay, the spectral comparison EQ, the colorized mixer channels, the retrospective MIDI recording, the combined selector tool, a reworked stereo delay, de-esser, and RoomWorks plugin, and several other features. So I'll actually link with one of those card things up above, but also down below in the video description of my review of Cubase 10.5. And then you'll be able to come up with your own assessment whether it's worth the upgrade or not. So yes, that is the end of the video. If you do like this, then please hit that like button. If you want to see more Cubase tutorials, more in-depth stuff, then consider hitting that subscribe button. I do cover a lot of updates and new features of Cubase and Steinberg related products. I do mixing and mastering tutorials and things like plugin reviews. So thanks for watching, take care, and bye-bye.